This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Ukrainian Jews caught in the crossfire of a possible Russian invasion. Will they flee the fighting? Plus, a top U.S. senator warns that a nuclear Iran would be a global game changer. And a Christian pastors group is one of the first to visit Israel after some COVID pandemic restrictions are lifted. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Many observers expect a Russian invasion into Ukraine could come any day. In the meantime, Israel has been making plans to help the thousands of Jews who may be caught in the crossfire. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett called on Israelis in Ukraine to leave. I am calling again upon Israelis in Ukraine, come home. Don't take unnecessary risks. Don't wait for a situation where you really want to come back, but it will be impossible. Be responsible for yourselves, leave Ukraine as quickly as possible, and come home. But Israel is concerned not only for its citizens, but also for the tens of thousands of other Jews in Ukraine. Former Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, is involved in that effort.
So I have been in touch with the leadership of the Jewish communities in Ukraine. They are confused about their future. We told them the gates of Israel are always open for every Jew to come.
But Danon says even in the face of an invasion, it's a difficult decision.
But you know, it's not easy to relocate your family when you have a connection to your community, a job, elderly parents. It's not easy for them to come and just pack their things and move to Israel.
Yael Eckstein, head of the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, just spent time on the ground in Ukraine.
I felt all of the unknown of what will be in the future there, but what was very clear to me is that there's a thriving and strong Jewish community in Ukraine that isn't going anywhere so quickly.
In February 2020, CBN News accompanied 130 Ukrainian Jews who made Aliyah to Israel. Even now, the work goes on.
Continuing our operations, rain or shine, no matter what's going on. And there are those who have always dreamed about making Aliyah and are jumping on this time now to move to Israel.
The state of Israel has a long history of rescuing Jews during dangerous times. With well over 100,000 Russian troops on the border of Ukraine, the Jews in Ukraine may seek Israel's experience in their hour of need. While the possible Russian invasion of Ukraine is getting the headlines, one U.S. senator came here to Jerusalem to say it's important to pay close attention to Iran. Senator Lindsey Graham came to Jerusalem to learn more from Israeli officials about how close Iran is to a nuclear weapon.
I don't know how close they are, but after being briefed, I'm more nervous than I was before I came. And I'm going to go back home to our intel officials, compare notes, and see if we can get the Biden administration to work with Republicans and Democrats and the Israelis to clearly articulate what we mean when we say no weapon.
Graham wants Israel and the U.S. to be fully unified when it comes to drawing lines in the sand with Iran.
Israel says it's unacceptable for them to have nuclear capability. America says a nuclear weapon. So what's the difference? There is a difference. The purpose here is to establish red lines, to let the Iranians know in the area of weaponization, enrichment, and missile technology, what would be red lines if you crossed, all bets are off. I think the world would be a safer place if we could provide clarity to the Iranian regime as to what we mean by you can't have a nuclear weapon.
This threat, combined with other international issues, come at a time when America is perceived as weak, especially by its enemies.
The Afghanistan withdrawal was a debacle. It's led to a lot of doubts about America, and now you got Russia threatening Ukraine, Taiwan being threatened by China. But the game changer for the world of all game changers would be a nuclear-armed Iran. And the one thing I know for sure, the Israeli people, through their government and military, will never allow the Iranians to get a nuclear weapon without a fight, and that's why I'm here.
Graham is convinced Israel will move against Iran if it feels the need.
They will use force, if necessary, to stop a nuclear-capable Iran because they believe it would be an existential threat to the Jewish state. They need additional capability, tankers and some kind of weapons, different kind of weapons. I'm going to try to lead the charge to give them that capability.
The Iranian threat includes a dangerous mix of nuclear technology and religious ideology.
The Iranians threaten the Jewish state daily. Their theocracy, and their theocracy has no place for a Jewish state or Christians. We're all infidels in their eyes, and they want to purify Islam and destroy Israel and come after us. They want to master religion. The Germans wanted to master race. So people like that should not have a nuclear weapon.
Graham says his visit brings a message to Israelis while also sending one to Americans.
To our friends in Israel, America has your back. We have common values. We have common enemies. I regularly pray for our friends here in Israel. The eyes and ears for America is Israel in a troubled region. I tell all my constituents back home, why does Israel matter so much to us? Well, there's a religious component, in my view, but just without any concern for religion, it's a democracy in a troubled region that is America's eyes and ears to protect our homeland. And any threat to Israel is really a threat to us.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was also in Israel as head of a congressional delegation, the first stop on a tour that also includes Europe. They met with Israeli leaders and expressed solidarity with Israel regarding Iran.
We're together in the fight against terrorism posed by Iran, both in the region and also its nuclear development. The nuclear threat of Iran is a global one. It's a threat to the world. Israel's proximity to Iran is a concern to all of us, and we are a responsibility for all of us.
Coming up, Israel's Prime Minister pays an historic visit to the Gulf country of Bahrain. In another historic moment, Bahrain's king greeted Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett on the first visit of an Israeli leader to Bahrain. It's another step forward for the Abraham Accords agreement signed a year and a half ago between Israel and 4 Arab states.
I consider it a historical day to receive the Prime Minister of Israel. His visit to Bahrain will be a fruitful visit, a successful visit because of his determination and leadership towards a joint integrated effort for the best of the two peoples. I thank him for coming here.
Your Majesty, it's been a huge honor to visit your wonderful kingdom of Bahrain, and I admire your courage and your determination to build your country. I think we discussed many ways to build new bridges and an architecture for a stronger and more stable region.
Well, the Abraham Accords became one of the cornerstones of the Trump administration's Mideast policy. Former U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman was one of the architects of the Abraham Accords. And CBN CEO Gordon Robertson interviewed Friedman on the 700 Club recently about Friedman's new book, Sledgehammer. Robertson asked him about the impact the Abraham Accords could have on the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians.
Well, let's talk about the future then. What do you see as the future of the Abraham Accords? I've said on this program that the greatest enemy of the Palestinian people is the Palestinian Authority. As long as they want to hold on to some kind of dream that they can drive Israel into the sea, as long as Hamas is in control of Gaza, you're never going to see any kind of economy, any kind of future. It's always going to be hopeless. Do you see hope here for peace with the Palestinian Authority? And if so, how do we get there?
Well, I think you're exactly right in your assessment of the current circumstances. The biggest problem is the leadership. The leadership is deeply oppressive of the Palestinian people. Palestinian people, many of whom I got to know well over my 4 years as ambassador, really just want what everybody wants. They want a better life for their children. They want more opportunity, better education. They want more infrastructure within their communities. I mean, these are not complicated things that are undeliverable. They're being held hostage by corrupt and venal leaders. I think those leaders will change over time. They will kind of cycle out. And the most important thing is for the Palestinian people to see the opportunity that exists throughout the region. They're paying very careful attention to the relationship that Israel is forging now with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Sudan, with Morocco. And they see what's coming of it. There's massive trade, tourism, opportunity, a huge amount of business investment. And, the Palestinian people are well educated. They understand that there is a future that they can grab. Their leadership stands between them and a better future. But look, we broke through a lot of molds in order to get the Abraham Accords. I think we will ultimately get to the point where the Palestinians embrace this new Middle East. I think if we were still in office, we would have Saudi Arabia as an Abraham Accords partner. I think we'd have potentially 5 or 10 more. That is the direction of the Middle East. I mean, oddly enough, the Middle East is now, kind of leading the world towards a more peaceful future. I don't think anybody ever thought that would happen 10, 20 years ago. So we're bursting with opportunity. And I think it's just a question of the U.S. Encouraging that and sending the right signals.
All right. Well, the current administration doesn't seem to want to do that, at least from what I'm reading. They've restored funding to UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, which just seems to fund Palestinian discontent. They've restored payments to the Palestinian Authority that reward the martyr payments. They're trying to reopen a consulate to the Palestinian Authority, and of all places, Jerusalem. They're trying to. It looks like they're trying to do a reset. You're working on a foundation to further the Abraham Accords. In the current political environment, the current administration, how can people who are watching right now, how can they help you further peace in the Middle East through what you're doing?
Well, look, our focus, and this was a phrase coined by Ronald Reagan, not by me, but we have the Friedman Center for Peace Through Strength. And the goal of the foundation is to expand the relationships that Israel has forged with Arab countries, but to do it from a position of principle, from a position of strength. Not, as you point out, not by chasing the Palestinians, not by throwing money at corrupt organizations like UNRWA, not by funding, God forbid, the payment of terrorists, which is a reprehensible policy, but by educating the world, the region and the world, that there is a better future. But that future has to be consistent with the Judeo-Christian values that make America great, that make Israel a great nation, that make that relationship strong. It all comes down to me, some very basic, simple things. We became a great nation because we adhered to Judeo-Christian values. Support for Israel is very much part of those values. We can't be asked to compromise that. We have to live within those worlds, but unapologetically to show within that construct how there is a better world available to those who seek it, to those who approach Israel in good faith and wish to make peace. And I think that was the theme of the Abraham Accords, and we're going to continue to pursue that theme diplomatically, educationally, philanthropically, as best as we can.
Up next, Israeli truckers join part of the global movement to reduce the restrictions of the global pandemic. Israelis upset about COVID restrictions and what they see as laws infringing on their freedom are taking a cue from Canadian truckers. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl takes us to the streets of Jerusalem to hear what they are saying.
While they may not have blocked bridges or trade, thousands of vehicles across Israel traveled to Jerusalem for the first day of this protest. While it started small, numbers grew by evening. Behind me are a couple of hundred protesters outside the Israeli Knesset. They're part of what's being called the Freedom Convoy. Thousands of Israelis are coming up to Jerusalem to protest what they say is a violation of their democratic rights.
We're citizens. We care about this country, and we're fed up with all the craziness here. We decided we want to return our lives to ourselves.
Demonstrators want legislation dubbed the coronavirus law repealed. Passed in January as part of ending the pandemic state of emergency, it also gives the government power to reimpose restrictions if it deems necessary, including the Green Pass, which limits access for the unvaccinated. In a statement, the Constitution Committee chairman says the law would enable a transition to a special health situation in which there's a more appropriate balance between protecting our fundamental rights and the need to prevent harm to the public's health. Legal expert Professor Eugene Kontorovich explains why some are wary.
It's scary and it institutionalizes a system for rapidly imposing COVID restrictions with a kind of sense that the COVID situation is not gone, but that we're going to be in a permanent COVID quasi-emergency that can trigger an emergency right away. It's not scary in that it actually in some ways increases Knesset supervision, but the question is what's going to happen in practice.
Commentator Avi Abelo says the Israeli public doesn't want the government to have emergency powers to suddenly impose restrictions.
Many of Israelis are waking up and finally being vocal about wanting to get back to a normal where government is not running our lives, where our medical information can once again be private, when there's no more coercion of medical procedures.
We want to cancel the imaginary emergency situation law. We don't have an emergency situation here.
For the freedom, for the sake of the future of our children and for today. There is something suspicious about everything that's going on.
Motorists came from some 40 different locations. Others stood on bridges, overpasses, and along roads cheering them on.
I'm here to join this movement, which is a movement for freedom. I just want to be counted as one who did something and not just sat at home.
I'm very much in favor of democracy in our country, and we've lost that completely. We have to fight to return to our freedom.
The situation in the country is simply lousy. It's good that you're here today because the media in Israel doesn't cover these protests.
Reuven Doron, a Messianic believer, has been leading a prayer vigil outside the Knesset for months.
We are here today praying that our government will listen to the cries of the people, that our government will take notice from other experts other than their own internal committees and deliberations, but will listen to the bigger story and give the people a break.
Convoy organizers say they plan to keep up the protest until the law is repealed and the rights they feel they have lost are restored. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Later in the week, Israeli Prime Minister Bennett announced that the Omicron wave had been broken and that Israel would no longer be using the Green Pass. He said Israel would be lifting more restrictions in the near future. Up next, Christian pastors become one of the first groups to visit Israel as travel to the Holy Land begins to reopen. Since early 2020, few visitors have been able to travel to Israel. Doors opened briefly last summer, but closed after a few months. Now doors are beginning to open again, and CBN News met with one Christian group back in the land. These pastors got the chance to visit Israel thanks to Eagle's Wings Ministry, a group focused on advancing biblical mandates such as spiritual community.
We are so glad after 2.5 years that we couldn't come back to the land to bring these pastors, almost 30 pastors from all over America, from the UK and from Canada, because we're living in a moment in the Christian church that we're reconnecting to the Jewish roots of our faith and standing in support of the modern state of Israel. And these pastors are just every day gaining a sense of focus and clarity and commitment to what God is doing in this place.
I've been here a few times, but this particular time time. It's really touched me not only to, to tap into my Christian roots, but really to tap into the Jewish roots.
For these pastors, a chance to experience the land where the Bible comes alive.
Honestly, it means finding history and bringing it to life for me. We read the Bible constantly. I preach from the Bible. Over these past 9 days, I've actually walked the Bible.
At one point, the group gathered around a piano on the promenade and began spontaneous worship.
I'm gonna build my life on you. I'm gonna build my life on you. I'm gonna build my life on you.
Pastors reflected on how this trip will enrich their ministry, especially first-time visitor, Pastor Joe Reeser.
It's planted a seed. It's made an impact. And I'm convinced of this, there's probably not an area of my ministry, my leadership, my future, my planning, my strategizing, that is not going to be impacted by the influence of the land and the people and what God is doing, not just what he has done historically, but what he is doing through this place.
The pastors are having their paradigms shifted. They're having their hearts softened and awakened.
For years, Stearns has led the Day of Prayer for the Peace of Jerusalem, and he says it's more important than ever.
We believe that at least one day a year, the hearts of the global church should turn back to Zion, should turn back and pray for the coming of our King, the return of our King. This has taken on all over the world. So I invite all believers to set aside the first Sunday of every October as the global day of prayer for the peace of Jerusalem.
Well, that's a hopeful sign that more and more people from around the world can come back here to the Holy Land. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And you can also access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And don't forget to sign up for our email blasts so you can continue to receive all of our exciting CBN content. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.